They said she fell overboard. They said it was an accident. They said the ocean had taken her, and there was nothing anyone could do. But David Mitchell never believed them. For 6 years, he searched for answers in a case that had gone cold before it even began. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman he married, the family he trusted, and the weekend that destroyed his life. It started as a celebration Memorial Day weekend, 2019. The Mitchell family had rented a 42-foot yacht for a 3-day cruise along the North Carolina coast. David and his wife Sarah had been married for 8 years, and this trip was supposed to mark a new beginning. They'd been through a rough patch, the kind that tests every marriage: long work hours, mounting bills, the stress of trying for a baby that never came. But they were working through it, or so David thought. Sarah's brother Marcus had organized the whole thing. He was the successful one in the family, the older brother who'd made it big in commercial real estate. Marcus always knew how to throw money at problems, and when he sensed the tension between his sister and her husband, he'd insisted they needed quality time together. Family time. He'd invited their parents too, Robert and Linda Harper, both in their late 60s, still sharp and active. It would be 5 of them on the water, reconnecting, relaxing, letting the salt air wash away whatever had been building between them on land. David remembered standing on the dock that Friday morning, watching Sarah laugh at something Marcus said as they loaded supplies onto the boat. She looked radiant in her white sundress, her auburn hair catching the early light. He'd fallen in love with that laugh 15 years ago, back when they were both working at the same marketing firm in Raleigh. She'd been the creative director's assistant, and he'd been a junior copywriter trying to make his mark. Their first conversation had been about a typo in a client presentation, and somehow it had turned into coffee, then dinner, then a life together. But lately that laugh had become rare. She'd grown distant over the past year, spending more time on her phone, taking calls in other rooms, coming home late from her job at the nonprofit where she managed donor relations. David had noticed. Of course, he'd asked her about it. She'd said she was fine, just stressed about work, about life, about the baby thing. They'd been trying for 3 years with no success, and it had taken a toll on both of them. But she'd promised him on that dock, with her hand in his, that this weekend would be different. They would talk, they would reconnect, they would figure out their next steps together. The first day had been perfect. They'd sailed out past the barrier islands, anchored in a quiet cove, swam in the crystal clear water. Marcus had grilled steaks on the yacht's outdoor kitchen, while Robert told stories about sailing trips from his Navy days. Linda had fussed over everyone, making sure they had enough sunscreen, enough water, enough of everything. It was the kind of family gathering David had always wanted, having grown up in foster care with no real family of his own. The Harpers had welcomed him completely when he married Sarah. They'd become his family too. That night, they'd sat under the stars drinking wine, talking about memories. Sarah had been quiet, but David had attributed it to exhaustion from the sun and swimming. She'd excused herself early, saying she wanted to read in the cabin. David had stayed up with Marcus and Robert, talking about sports and politics and all the safe topics men discuss when they're trying to bond. He'd gone to bed around 11. Sarah had been asleep, or pretending to be. He'd kissed her forehead and fallen into the deep sleep of someone physically tired and mentally at peace. When he woke up Saturday morning, she was gone. At first, no one panicked. The yacht was big, but not that big. David checked the bathrooms, the galley, the deck. Marcus checked the cabin spaces. Linda looked everywhere Sarah might have gone for privacy. But within 10 minutes, the reality became unavoidable. Sarah wasn't on the boat. David remembered the moment of realization like a physical blow. He'd run to the railing, scanning the water in every direction, shouting her name until his throat was raw. The ocean had been calm, glassy in the early morning light. Nothing disturbed its surface, no splash, no struggle, no sign of anyone in distress. Marcus had immediately called the Coast Guard while Robert started the engine to begin searching the area. Linda had held David's hand, her face pale with shock, telling him over and over that Sarah was a strong swimmer, that she'd be okay, that they'd find her. But they didn't find her. The Coast Guard arrived within 40 minutes with a helicopter and rescue boats. They searched for 12 hours that first day, then resumed at dawn on Sunday. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence that Sarah had ever been in the water. It was as if she'd simply evaporated into the salt air. The investigation that followed was perfunctory. The Coast Guard classified it as an accidental drowning, probably a fall overboard during the night. The local sheriff's department interviewed everyone on the boat. Their stories were consistent. Sarah had gone to bed early. No one had heard anything unusual. When David woke up, she was gone. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of a struggle, no reason to suspect anything other than a tragic accident. But David couldn't accept it. Sarah wasn't the type to wander around on deck alone at night. She got seasick easily and preferred to stay below when the boat was moving, and she was cautious, almost overly so. She wouldn't have leaned over a railing without purpose. She wouldn't have risked falling. He'd tried to tell the investigators this, but they'd looked at him with sympathy and something else. Suspicion, maybe. The husband is always the first suspect, he knew that. So he'd submitted to their questions, their scrutiny, their search of his phone records and finances. He had nothing to hide. He'd been asleep when Sarah disappeared. He'd loved his wife. He wanted answers as much as anyone. The media attention had been intense but brief. Missing woman on weekend cruise, tragic accident at sea. The local news covered it for a few days, then moved on to other stories. Sarah's case joined the thousands of other unsolved disappearances filed away in bureaucratic archives. But David never moved on. For 6 years, he searched. He hired a private investigator who found nothing new. He posted on missing persons websites and true crime forums. He kept Sarah's case alive on social media, sharing her photo every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. He refused to have her declared legally dead, even though it would have made financial sense. He couldn't let her go. He also couldn't ignore the things that started bothering him in the months after she vanished. Small things at first. The way Marcus had been so quick to call the Coast Guard as if he'd been prepared for something to go wrong. The way Linda had cried but seemed almost composed, as if working through expected grief rather than shocking loss. The way Robert had avoided eye contact with him during the investigation, his answers to questions just a little too rehearsed. David had pushed these observations aside initially. Grief made everyone act strange. Trauma manifested differently in different people. He'd lost his wife. They'd lost a daughter and sister. Of course they were all struggling. But then he'd found the journal. 3 months after Sarah's disappearance, while packing up her things from their home office, David had discovered a leather-bound journal tucked behind some books on the top shelf. He'd never known Sarah kept a journal. She'd never mentioned it. The entries were sporadic, dating back about 2 years before the cruise. Most were mundane, observations about work or frustrations about their fertility struggles. But as David read deeper, a pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. Sarah had been afraid. She never said of what exactly. The entries were vague, emotional rather than factual, but she'd written about feeling watched, about family secrets that weighed on her conscience, about conversations with her mother that left her shaken and confused, about Marcus pressuring her about something she wouldn't specify. One entry, dated 2 months before the cruise, had stopped David's heart. I can't keep pretending I don't know. But if I tell the truth, it will destroy everything. What do I do? Who can I trust? Another entry just 3 weeks before the trip. David asked me again what's wrong. I wanted to tell him. I almost told him, but Marcus said it would be dangerous. For both of us. The final entry was dated the Thursday before they left for the cruise. One more weekend. Marcus promised me we'd talk on the boat, that he'd explain everything, that we'd figure out a solution together. I'm terrified, but I have to trust him. He's my brother. Family protects family, right? David had taken the journal to the police. They'd read it, documented it, and told him it was interesting, but not evidence of a crime. The entries were too vague. They could mean anything. People kept all kinds of private thoughts in journals. It didn't prove foul play, but it proved enough for David. His wife had known something, and that something had gotten her killed. He was sure of it. The problem was he had no idea what the secret was. And the 3 people who might know, Marcus, Linda, and Robert, had circled their wagons. They'd supported David financially in the immediate aftermath, helped pay for the funeral service he'd held without a body. But when he'd started asking questions, pressing them about Sarah's journal entries, their warmth had cooled. Marcus had told him grief was making him paranoid. Linda had cried and said he was traumatizing them by refusing to accept the accident. Robert had simply stopped taking his calls. Within a year, the Harper family had cut David out completely. He was no longer invited to holidays or family gatherings. Marcus had changed his phone number. Linda had moved to Florida to live with her sister. Robert had sold the yacht and refused to discuss anything related to that weekend. David had been alone with his suspicions and no way to prove them. Until 6 weeks ago. The call had come from an unknown number on a Tuesday afternoon. David had almost not answered, but something made him pick up. The voice on the other end had been female, young, nervous. "Is this David Mitchell, Sarah Mitchell's husband?" His heart had started pounding. "Yes." "Who is this?" "My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm a producer for Investigation Discovery. We're doing a documentary series on unsolved disappearances, and we'd like to feature Sarah's case." David had done media interviews before, local news pieces that went nowhere. But a documentary was different. A documentary meant investigation, resources, national attention. "I'll do anything," he'd said. "What do you need?" What Rebecca had told him next had changed everything. The production team had been researching Sarah's disappearance for months. They'd interviewed former classmates, work colleagues, friends from college, and they'd found something the police had missed. Sarah had been adopted. The revelation had hit David like a physical blow. In 8 years of marriage, Sarah had never mentioned being adopted. Never. Her parents were Robert and Linda Harper. Her brother was Marcus Harper. That was the family he'd known, the family that had welcomed him. But according to birth records Rebecca's team had uncovered, Sarah had been born Sarah Elizabeth Warren in a small town in eastern Kentucky. She'd been placed in foster care at age 2 after her biological mother died of a drug overdose. She'd been adopted by the Harpers at age 4, and her name had been legally changed to Sarah Harper. "Did you know any of this?" Rebecca had asked. "No," David had whispered. "She never told me." "That's not the most interesting part," Rebecca had continued. "We found Sarah's biological father. He's alive. His name is Michael Warren, and he's been in and out of prison most of his life. We interviewed him last month, and he said something that made us dig deeper." David had gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. "What did he say?" "He said Sarah had reached out to him 2 years ago. She'd found him through a genealogy website, one of those DNA testing services. They'd exchanged a few emails, then she'd asked to meet him in person. He drove up from Kentucky to meet her at a diner in Raleigh about 18 months before she disappeared." The timeline had aligned with the journal entries. Sarah had been troubled, scared, keeping secrets around that same time. "What did they talk about?" David had asked. "He wouldn't tell us everything, said it was private family business. But he did say Sarah had questions about her adoption, about why her biological mother gave her up, about whether there were other relatives she didn't know about." Rebecca had paused, and David could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "Mr. Mitchell, Michael Warren told us that Sarah learned something during that meeting that upset her deeply. He said she'd asked him about her biological mother's family, about whether she had any half-siblings, and when he told her the truth, she'd gone pale. She'd left the diner without finishing her food." "What truth?" David had demanded. "What did he tell her?" "He wouldn't say on camera, but off the record, after the interview was over, he pulled our producer aside and said something. He said, 'Tell Sarah's husband to look into Marcus Harper's real mother. Tell him to ask why the family kept 2 secrets instead of 1. The documentary team had investigated further and discovered what Sarah must have learned that day in the diner. Marcus Harper wasn't Linda and Robert's biological son either. He'd been adopted too, 3 years before Sarah, from the same foster care system in Kentucky, from the same small town, and according to birth records that took weeks to uncover, Marcus and Sarah shared the same biological mother. They were half-siblings by blood, not just by adoption. The Harpers had adopted 2 children from the same broken family and had never told them they were related by more than legal paperwork. They'd raised them as brother and sister without revealing they were actually half-siblings who'd been separated in the foster system and reunited by chance in an adoptive home. When Rebecca had told David this, his first reaction had been confusion. Why keep it secret? What did it matter? It was actually a beautiful story, wasn't it? 2 biological siblings finding each other through adoption. But then Rebecca had shared what her team had learned next, and David had understood why Sarah had been afraid. The production team had tracked down records from the Kentucky foster system, case files that had been sealed for decades. They'd found a social worker who'd worked on both children's placements, now retired and willing to talk. Marcus had been taken from his biological mother when he was 5 years old. The reason for removal had been documented abuse and neglect. But there was another notation in the file, something the social worker had flagged for follow-up: suspected sexual abuse by an adult male in the home. That investigation had never been completed because the biological mother had died before it could proceed. Sarah had been removed from the same home 2 years later, as a toddler, for the same reasons. The social worker had told Rebecca's team that she'd always wondered about the 2 children from that case she'd noted in her files, that they should be placed separately in different families because of concerning behaviors Marcus had exhibited toward the younger child. But somehow, 3 years later, they'd ended up in the same adoptive home. "We think Robert and Linda knew," Rebecca had told David. "We think they knew Marcus and Sarah were biological half-siblings, and they knew there was a troubling history, but they wanted to keep the family together. They thought love could fix anything." David's mind had been racing. "You think Marcus hurt Sarah, even as children?" "We think Sarah found out about their biological connection and about Marcus's history, and we think that's what she couldn't keep pretending not to know. That's the secret that weighed on her." The journal entries had suddenly made horrible sense. Marcus pressuring her, the family closing ranks, the danger she'd felt. But why would they go on a cruise together if she was afraid of him? David had asked. "That's what we need to investigate further," Rebecca had said. "We think the cruise was Marcus's idea to isolate her, to make sure she couldn't tell anyone what she knew. We think Robert and Linda might have been complicit, protecting their son rather than their daughter." David had felt sick. "You think they killed her together? The whole family?" "We think at minimum they know what happened to her, and we think with national media attention, we can pressure them into revealing the truth." "Will you participate in the documentary? Will you tell your story?" David had said yes without hesitation. The documentary had aired 2 weeks ago, titled "Secrets at Sea: The Sarah Mitchell Mystery." It had featured David's interviews, the journal entries, the adoption records, Michael Warren's testimony, the social worker's concerns. It had laid out a damning case that Sarah had discovered a dark family secret and had disappeared before she could expose it. The media explosion had been immediate. Cable news picked up the story. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. The hashtag #JusticeForSarah had trended on Twitter for 3 days. And finally, after 6 years of silence, the pressure had become too much for the Harper family. Marcus had been the first to crack. He'd called a press conference 5 days after the documentary aired, standing in front of cameras with his lawyer beside him, looking 20 years older than his actual age. "I want to tell the truth about what happened to my sister," he'd said, his voice shaking. "I want to tell the truth about our family." What Marcus had revealed in that press conference had been broadcast live across the country. David had watched from his apartment, his hands trembling, tears streaming down his face. Marcus had confirmed that he and Sarah were biological half-siblings. He'd confirmed that he'd learned this fact when he was 18, when Robert and Linda had finally told him the truth about his adoption. But Sarah hadn't been told the family had decided she didn't need to know, that it would only upset her, that it was better to let sleeping dogs lie. Marcus had kept the secret for years, but then Sarah had done one of those DNA tests, looking for answers about their fertility problems, wanting to know if there were genetic factors they should consider, and the DNA test had connected her with distant cousins who'd led her to the truth about her biological family. When Sarah had confronted Marcus after her meeting with their biological father, Marcus had panicked. He'd begged her not to tell David, not to tell anyone. He'd said it would destroy their family, that their parents were old and didn't need this stress. But Sarah had been insistent. She'd said David deserved to know, that she was tired of living with secrets and lies. So Marcus had suggested the cruise one last family weekend where they could talk privately, where they could figure out how to tell David together, where they could control the narrative. But on the boat, things had gone wrong. Marcus had admitted that he'd confronted Sarah on the deck Saturday morning before dawn. He'd been unable to sleep, tormented by the conversation they needed to have. He'd found her standing at the railing, looking out at the water. They'd argued. Sarah had told him she'd decided to tell David everything as soon as they got back to shore. She'd said she couldn't live with the lies anymore, that their marriage had been built on a foundation of secrets, and she needed to clear the air. Marcus had begged her to reconsider, and then, in his desperation, he'd told her something he'd never revealed before. He'd told her why the family had really kept the secret. The biological connection wasn't the only issue. Marcus had been in therapy for years for inappropriate thoughts and behaviors related to Sarah. When he'd learned they were biological half-siblings, he'd been confused, disturbed, unable to process his feelings. The family had paid for intensive therapy, had worked hard to help him establish healthy boundaries. But the feelings had never completely gone away, and Robert and Linda had known. They'd known their son struggled with something dark and troubling. They'd protected him, managed him, ensured he was never alone with Sarah as adults. When Sarah had heard this, she'd reacted with horror and anger. She'd screamed at Marcus, demanded to know why no one had protected her, why her parents had prioritized his secrets over her safety. And Marcus had broken down completely. He'd told her he was sorry, that he'd never acted on his feelings, that he'd worked hard to control them. But Sarah had been furious, disgusted, betrayed. She'd told him she was going to tell David everything, including this. She'd told him she was going to expose the entire twisted family dynamic. She'd said she didn't care if it destroyed everyone because they'd destroyed her first by lying to her for her entire life. And then she'd turned to walk away from him. Marcus had grabbed her arm to stop her. They'd struggled at the railing, and Sarah had fallen. Not into the water, into the yacht itself. Marcus's voice had broken completely as he'd described what had happened next. Sarah had fallen onto the lower deck, hitting her head on the metal edge of a storage compartment. The sound had been sickening. He'd said she'd crumpled immediately, blood pooling beneath her head. Marcus had climbed down to her, checked for a pulse. She'd been breathing, but unconscious, badly injured. He'd panicked. He'd run to wake his parents. And this was where Marcus's story had become even more horrific. Robert and Linda had come on deck, seen Sarah's condition, and made a decision. They decided that if Sarah woke up, she would destroy their family. She would tell everyone about Marcus's issues, about the secrets they'd kept, about their failure as parents. So they'd let her die. Marcus had sobbed as he'd described watching his parents drag Sarah's body to the railing and push her into the ocean while she was still breathing. She'd been unconscious, unable to fight back, unable to save herself. They'd weighted her down with diving equipment so she'd sink rather than float. And then they'd woken David and told him Sarah was missing, playing out their charade of shock and grief. The three of them had maintained the lie for 6 years, living with the knowledge that they'd murdered Sarah to protect their family secrets. But the documentary had broken them. The exposure had been too much. The weight of the secret had finally crushed them. Marcus had been arrested immediately after his confession. Robert and Linda had been taken into custody at their respective homes. All three had been charged with murder and conspiracy. The trial was still ongoing. Marcus had pleaded guilty and was cooperating with prosecutors, hoping for a reduced sentence. Robert and Linda were fighting the charges, claiming Marcus acted alone and they'd been coerced into helping dispose of the body. David didn't care about the legal specifics anymore. He had his answer. He knew what had happened to his wife. Sarah had been killed by the family she'd trusted, the family she'd thought would protect her. She'd been murdered for wanting to tell the truth, for refusing to live in the shadows of secrets and lies any longer. The documentary had been right. It was a brutal family secret that had turned a simple sale into a murder that the whole country was now watching. But for David, the attention was meaningless. The justice felt hollow. Sarah was still gone. Their future together was still stolen. The life they could have had was still destroyed. He visited the coast sometimes, standing on the shore where they'd launched that last weekend cruise. He imagined her out there in the dark water, weighted down with diving equipment, dying alone while her family saved themselves. And he thought about the journal entry she'd written. Family protects family. Right? She'd been wrong. The family had protected itself by destroying her. David would spend the rest of his life making sure the world remembered Sarah Mitchell, not as a woman who'd fallen overboard in a tragic accident, but as a woman who'd demanded truth in a family built on lies, who'd refused to participate in covering up dark secrets, who'd paid with her life for her integrity. The yacht had been recovered from impound and sold at auction. David had bought it using Sarah's life insurance money. He'd renamed it Truth Teller, and now used it to take groups of abuse survivors out on memorial cruises, creating space for people to tell their stories without fear. It was his way of honoring Sarah's memory. Her refusal to keep quiet had ultimately exposed evil that might have continued for generations. Her death had saved others from the toxic secrecy that had destroyed her. The Harper family was finished. Marcus would spend decades in prison. Robert and Linda faced the same fate if convicted. Their name had become synonymous with the worst kind of family dysfunction, a cautionary tale about the cost of protecting abusers. And Sarah's story had become a rallying cry for others who'd been silenced by their families, pressured to keep secrets, made to feel crazy for wanting to tell the truth. 6 years of searching had led to an answer David had never wanted but needed to know. His wife hadn't abandoned him. She hadn't fallen by accident. She'd been murdered by people who valued their reputation more than her life. But she'd won in the end. The truth had surfaced despite their best efforts to drown it, and that truth would echo far longer than any of their lies ever could. David stood at the railing of Truth Teller now, 6 years and 6 weeks after Sarah had disappeared, watching the sun set over the same waters that had taken her. He whispered to the wind and the waves, hoping somehow she could hear him. "I found out why, Sarah. I found out what happened. And everyone knows now, everyone knows what they did to you." The ocean offered no response, but David felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in 6 years. The mystery was solved. The guilty were exposed. And Sarah's memory would live on, not as a victim who'd vanished without trace, but as a woman who'd refused to live with lies, even when those lies came from the people who were supposed to love her most. The whole country had watched her story unfold. But for David, it wasn't a story. It was the truth about the woman he'd loved, the family that had betrayed her, and the price she'd paid for demanding honesty in a world built on secrets. And that truth would never vanish, no matter how deep anyone tried to bury it.